The wind howls like a banshee, a raw, serrated sound that cuts through threadbare wool. Eliza. Small for her age, stands motionless before the church steps. Her face is a porcelain mask, betraying nothing. Pinned to the chest of her worn dress is a piece of canvas, flapping violently. On it, 3 words are scrawled in desperate, angry charcoal. She's yours now. The townsfolk of Providence Gulch give her a wide berth, their whispers snatched away by the gale. They see an omen, a stray. But Silas Kane, 40s, a man carved from granite and silence, sees something else. His face is a roadmap of scars and harsh sun, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. He moves through the crowd, a parting of the seas of judgment. He doesn't speak. He doesn't have to. He kneels, his gaze locking with Eliza's. His gloved fingers, surprisingly gentle, hover over the note. He reads it, and for a flicker of a moment, a decade of buried pain flashes in his eyes. He looks from the note to her face, a mirror of a ghost he thought long buried. This isn't just an orphan. This is a reckoning. Part 1. The ghost of Isabella. The silence that followed Silas reading the note was heavier than the impending snow. The townsfolk, huddled in their piety and suspicion, watched as this ghost of a man, who rarely came to town and spoke even less, confronted the tiny, abandoned specter. Silas's reputation preceded him, a rancher from the unforgiving lands north of the Gulch, a place whispered to be haunted by his own past. They said he'd lost a wife, or maybe his soul, out in those badlands. He finally looked up from the note, his gaze sweeping over the child's face. He wasn't just seeing a little girl. He was seeing eyes the color of wild violets, the same impossible shade as Isabella's. Isabella, the woman who had burned a brand on his heart with a love as wild and untamable as a prairie fire before she'd vanished from his life, leaving nothing but smoke and ash. This child, it was impossible. Yet, here she was. His hand, scarred and calloused from a life of breaking horses and mending fences, trembled almost imperceptibly as he unpinned the canvas. He folded it with a strange reverence, tucking it deep into the inner pocket of his greatcoat, a secret kept close to a broken heart. "Come on," he finally rumbled, his voice a low gravel, scraped raw by disuse, but lacking the cruelty she'd grown accustomed to. Eliza didn't move. She clutched a crude burlap doll, its button eyes staring blankly. She had been told to be brave. Her mother, a woman with a fleeting smile and perpetually sad eyes, had kissed her forehead that morning, a ghost of a touch that still tingled, and walked away without looking back, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. That kiss was all Eliza had left of a life that was now gone. Silas didn't offer a hand. He simply stood, waiting. He was a mountain, patient and unmoving. He understood the language of fear. He saw it in the wild mustangs he tamed, that moment of hesitation before trust. The child's fear was different, quieter, but just as profound. "The horse is warm," he offered, another rumble from deep in his chest. "Warmer than this wind." It was the promise of warmth, not the command, that finally made her move. She took a hesitant step, then another, her worn-out boots crunching on the frozen earth. She followed the dark shape of his shadow, a shadow that, unlike others, didn't seem to want to swallow her whole. He led her to a formidable black stallion that snorted a plume of steam into the frigid air. With an effortless grace that belied his rugged frame, he lifted her onto the saddle, his hands lingering for a moment on her small form as if she were made of spun glass. He wrapped his heavy, sheepskin-lined coat around her, cocooning her in a world that smelled of leather, pine, and a faint, clean scent of the cold itself. From her perch, she looked back at the church steps, a stark white wound against the gray landscape. That was the place where she had ceased to be Isabella's daughter and had become Silas Kane's mystery. The ride to his ranch was a silent pilgrimage. Snowflakes, thick as goose down, began to drift from the bruised purple sky. He didn't prod or pry. He didn't ask her name or where she came from. The questions were a storm raging in his own mind, but he shielded her from it. "Is it you, Isabella? Is this your final cruel joke? Or is it a gift?" As they passed through a creaking wooden gate that marked the entrance to the Silent K Ranch, the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of his land. The cabin was a dark shape against the snow, a solitary sentinel with a single plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It wasn't much, but it was solid. It was real. He dismounted and lifted her down, his hands careful, his movements deliberate. "Place ain't much," he said, his words aimed more at the landscape than at her. "But it's honest." He led her onto the porch, the boards groaning under his weight. "You hungry?" Eliza didn't answer. She couldn't. Her voice was a bird trapped in her throat. She just hugged her burlap doll tighter, its familiar roughness a small anchor in a sea of terrifying newness. But as the door swung open, revealing a hearth with a softly crackling fire, a feeling she hadn't known for a long, long time began to uncurl in her chest. It wasn't safety, not yet, but it was the whisper of it. It was the first hint of a thaw in her own frozen world. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room with a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, and the stone fireplace that was the heart of the home. It was a man's space, functional and unadorned, yet it felt more welcoming than the crowded, whispering town. He had left a world of judgment behind to bring her into his world of silence. And in that silence, for the first time, she felt she might just be able to breathe. Part 2. The Language of Silence. The first night, Eliza didn't sleep. She sat curled in a large armchair by the fire, a heavy wool blanket draped over her, still clutching the burlap doll. She hadn't taken off her boots, a silent testament to her readiness to flee. She was a wild thing, brought in from the cold, unsure if the shelter was a haven or a trap. Silas moved around the small cabin with a practiced, quiet economy of motion. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his movements measured so as not to disturb the ghosts that shared his space. He ladled a thick, fragrant stew into a chipped enamel bowl and placed it on the small table near her, alongside a hunk of dark bread. "Eat when you're ready," he said, his voice low. Then, without another word, he pulled on his coat and went back outside, the crunch of his boots in the snow fading into the vast quiet of the night. He was tending the horses, giving her space, giving her the gift of not being watched. She waited, listening to the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind. Her stomach ached with a hunger that was more than just a need for food. It was a cavernous emptiness. Finally, she slid from the chair and crept to the table. The stew was rich with venison and root vegetables, and it was hot. It burned her tongue, but it was a good pain. It was a real feeling. She ate ravenously, messily, like a starved animal, not stopping until the bowl was wiped clean with the last of the bread. When Silas returned, his shoulders dusted with snow, he didn't comment on the empty bowl. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval and took the seat opposite her. He placed a pair of small, sturdy-looking boots on the floor between them. They were made of soft, oiled leather, clearly well cared for, and much smaller than his own. "They belonged to a cousin's girl," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "She's grown now. Figured they'd fit you better than those rags." Eliza stared at the boots. They were the first gift she had ever received that wasn't a prelude to a goodbye. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the leather. It was smooth and cool. She looked at her own boots, cracked and thin, the soles worn through. Without a word, she took them off and slid her feet into the new ones. They fit perfectly. "You don't have to say anything," Silas said, sensing the turmoil inside her. He pulled a block of pine and a whittling knife from his pocket. "But if you do, I'll listen." He didn't push. He didn't ask about the note, about her mother, about the life that had cast her out. He simply sat with her in the comfortable quiet, the rhythmic scrape of his knife on the wood, a soothing counterpoint to the storm outside. He was carving a horse, its form slowly emerging from the wood under his skilled hands. It was a quiet that didn't demand or accuse. It was a quiet that healed. That night, he made a bed for her on a cot near the stove, layering it with thick wool blankets. "You'll be warmer here," was all he said. She nodded and crawled under the covers, pulling them up to her ears, the scent of hay and wood smoke, a strange and comforting lullaby. Silas retreated to his own bed in the corner, leaving a small gap in the curtain he used for privacy. A silent invitation. In the dead of night, long after his breathing had evened out into the slow rhythm of sleep, Eliza crept from the cot. She tiptoed across the cold floorboards to the curtain and peered through the gap. She watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Proof of kindness, perhaps, or maybe just the simple, profound proof of someone who didn't leave in the morning. Reassured, she returned to her cot and, for the first time in a long time, fell into a dreamless sleep. When she woke, the cabin was filled with the pale, gray light of dawn. The fire was already rekindled, and the scent of coffee hung in the air. At the foot of her cot sat the small wooden horse, perfectly carved, its lines smooth and full of life. It was a gift left in silence, without fanfare or expectation. She picked it up, its wooden form solid and real in her hands, and held it to her chest. Silas was at the stove, his back to her. "You hungry?" he asked, without turning. She couldn't find her voice, but her nod was quicker this time, more certain. He turned then, and a rare, small smile touched the corners of his mouth, softening the harsh lines of his face, and Eliza, clutching the wooden horse, almost smiled back. Almost. Part 3. Echoes in a Wooden Chest. The days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the winter sun. A routine, unspoken and unwritten, began to form. Eliza started sweeping the cabin floor, not because Silas asked, but because the simple, repetitive motion was calming. It was a way to make her hands useful, to claim a small piece of this space as her own. The silence between them remained, but it had changed. It was no longer a careful, fragile thing. It was a shared language, a comfortable quiet built on a foundation of mutual respect for each other's solitude. One afternoon, Silas rode into Providence Gulch for supplies, leaving Eliza alone at the ranch for the first time. The cabin felt vast and empty without his solid presence. Driven by a curiosity that was stronger than her fear, she began to explore. Every creaking floorboard, every shadow in the corner, seemed to whisper stories she wasn't sure she was allowed to hear. In the corner of the room, beneath a window that looked out over the snow-covered valley, sat an old, scarred wooden chest. It wasn't locked. Its lid was slightly ajar. It called to her. This was his space, his history, and she knew she shouldn't intrude. But she also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her own story was somehow tied to what was inside. Her small hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. The chest smelled of cedar and thyme. Inside, nestled amongst folded linens and a tarnished silver locket, was a small, leather-bound journal, and beneath it, a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the top envelope was elegant, feminine, and achingly familiar. With a jolt that shot through her entire body, she recognized it. It was her mother's hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a violation, a trespass of the highest order. But she couldn't stop. Her fingers, acting of their own accord, untied the ribbon. The letters were addressed to Silas. She opened the first one, the paper brittle with age. My dearest Silas, the silence you left behind is louder than any city street. I see you in the sunset. I hear your voice in the wind. They tell me I made the right choice, that a life with him, a man of wealth and standing, is what a woman should want. They are fools. They do not know the wildness you woke in me. They do not know that my heart remains in a dusty cabin with a man who speaks in silence and loves with the force of a thunderstorm. I was a coward, my love. I chose safety over life. Do not forget me. Yours, always, Isabella. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She devoured the next letter and the next. They were a torrent of passionate, desperate love. A story of a fiery, secret romance between the town beauty and the silent rancher. A story of pressure from her family, of a forced marriage to a wealthy man she despised, and of a heart that belonged only to Silas. And then, the final letter. The paper was tear-stained, the ink slightly blurred. Silas, my love, my only love. He knows. My husband, he knows she is not his. He sees you in her eyes, the same wild violet eyes he has always hated. He calls her the devil's own daughter. He threatens to send her away, to an institution where her spirit will be broken. I cannot let that happen. I have no choice. I am sending her to the only true home her heart will ever know. To you. I know you are a man broken by my leaving, but you are a good man. You fix broken things. Here she is. Fix my greatest mistake. Love her, Silas. For me. Love our daughter. Isabella. Our daughter. The words exploded in Eliza's mind. She wasn't just an abandoned child. She was his child. The note pinned to her dress, "She's yours now," wasn't an accusation. It was a plea. A final, desperate act of a mother's love. She carefully folded the letters, retied the ribbon, and placed them back in the chest, exactly as she had found them. She closed the lid, the soft click echoing the sound of 1,000 pieces of her life falling into place. When Silas returned, the sacks of flour and beans slung over his shoulder, he found her sitting at the table, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. His eyes, sharp and perceptive, went from her face to the chest in the corner, and he knew. He didn't scold. He just set down the supplies and sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Eliza finally found her voice. It was small, a fragile thing, but it was clear. Is it true? Silas's gaze didn't waver. His voice, when he spoke, was like gravel being smoothed by a slow river. Every word. Why? She whispered, a universe of pain and confusion in that single word. Why didn't you tell me? Because, he said, leaning forward, his fierce, stormy eyes locking onto hers, I wanted you to stay because you chose to, not because you had to. I wanted you to trust the man, not the blood. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down Eliza's face. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of understanding, of a profound and overwhelming sense of belonging. That night, when he asked if she wanted to help mend a fence the next day, she didn't just nod. She looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, I would like that." It was the first choice she had ever truly made, the choice to be his daughter. Part 4. The Foundations of Home. The revelation in the chest didn't unleash a torrent of conversation. It settled between them, a deep, unspoken truth that changed everything and nothing at all. The quiet remained, but it was now filled with a new resonance, the comfortable silence of family. Silas was still Silas, a man of few words and deep currents. But now, when he looked at Eliza, she could see the ghost of Isabella in his eyes, a flicker of a love so fierce it had survived betrayal and a decade of lonely years. A week later, Eliza woke to the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood. Peeking through the small window of the main cabin, she saw Silas working on the old, dilapidated storage shed that stood beside the main house. He worked with a relentless, focused energy she recognized, the same energy he used to break a wild stallion or clear a field of stubborn rock. He wasn't just fixing something broken, he was building. She pulled on the boots he'd given her, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The scent of freshly cut pine was sharp and clean. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice still soft, but no longer hesitant. Silas didn't stop hammering. He sighted down a long plank of wood before answering. "A room," he said, his words punctuated by the blows of the hammer. "For you. A girl should have her own space, a place to put her things." Eliza stared, speechless. No one had ever made room for her. She had always been fitted into corners, into leftover spaces, expected to be small and invisible. The idea of a room, a space that was entirely hers, was a concept so foreign and so grand that she couldn't grasp it. She stood there for a long time, watching him work, half expecting him to stop, to tell her it was a joke. But he just kept hammering, the steady, rhythmic sound a promise being built, board by board. By evening, the structure had 4 solid walls and a sloping roof. When Silas finally put down his hammer and wiped the sweat from his brow, he gestured for her to come inside. It smelled of pine and hope. The floor was rough-hewn, the single window was small, but to Eliza, it was a palace. It was the most beautiful room in the world. That night, Silas moved the cot into her new room. As she lay in the dark, staring up at the raw wooden beams of the ceiling, she felt a sense of ownership, of belonging, that was so powerful it was almost painful. There were no angry footsteps on the other side of the wall, no shouting, no drunken tirades, just the sighing of the wind in the pines and the faint, comforting nicker of a horse in the nearby corral. This was the safety she had craved, a heavy, warm blanket she hadn't even realized she was freezing without. She got up and went to the door. Silas had fitted it with a simple wooden latch on the inside. A choice. A door she could close if she wanted to. The significance of that small piece of wood was not lost on her. When she returned to the cot, she saw something tucked under her pillow. It was a book, not new, but bound in thick, cracked leather. Inside the front cover, a name was written in faded, elegant ink. Isabella, her mother's name. On the first page, in Silas's blocky, unpracticed handwriting, were 3 words. "Read this, Eliza." No one had ever thought she might want to read. No one had ever thought she was capable of it. She traced the letters of her own name with her finger, whispering them to herself. This room, this book, this man. This was not just shelter. This was the beginning of a life of her own. The lessons began the next day. They sat at the table, the cabin warm against the winter chill, and with a patience she never would have expected, Silas taught her the letters. He pointed with a calloused finger, his voice a low rumble as he sounded out the words in her mother's journal. They were poems and observations, thoughts on the wild beauty of the land she had loved and left. Through the faded ink, Eliza began to meet the mother she barely remembered, a woman of passion and intelligence and deep sorrow. And through teaching her, Silas was sharing his own guarded heart, sharing the woman they had both loved and lost. It was a painful, beautiful communion, a way of building a bridge across the chasm of their shared grief. He was giving her more than just words on a page. He was giving her back her past, and in doing so, he was building her a future. Part 5. A Storm of the Heart. Spring arrived like a whispered promise, painting the harsh landscape with defiant strokes of green and gold. Eliza's laughter, once a rare and fragile sound, now echoed in the barn as she helped Silas with the newborn colts. He had started calling her Liza, and sometimes, when he thought she wasn't listening, my girl. She never corrected him. Their life settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of the ranch. It was a hard life, but a good one. The love between them was not one of grand declarations, but of quiet actions. It was in the way he'd leave a wildflower on her pillow, or the way she'd make sure his coffee was hot when he came in from the cold. It was a wild, deep love, born of loss and forged in silence. But the past was never truly buried. It was a sleeping wolf, and one night, a storm woke it. The thunder cracked like a whip, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. Wind tore at the shutters, and rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets. Storms had always terrified Eliza. They smelled of goodbye, of that last cold night on the church steps. But as she stood at the window of her small room, watching the lightning illuminate the violent, beautiful chaos of the storm, she felt something different. She felt the solid walls of her room around her. She felt the steady, protective presence of Silas in the next room. She felt safe. His heavy boots echoed on the floorboards, and he appeared at her door, a lantern held high, its golden light casting dancing shadows on his weathered face. "You all right, Liza?" he asked, his voice a low comfort against the roar of the storm. She nodded, but he stepped inside anyway. Storm's a mean one. Might be a long night. A fierce, protective love for this man swelled in her chest. A love that was a mirror of the one he held for her. A love that was a legacy from the mother she now knew through her journal. "Can I stay in the parlor with you?" she asked, the words coming easily. A slow smile spread across Silas's face, a smile that reached his stormy gray eyes. It was as if he'd been waiting her whole life to hear those words. They sat by the hearth, him in his worn armchair, her curled on the rug at his feet, wrapped in a thick blanket. The fire crackled, a defiant warmth against the raging storm. For the first time, Silas began to talk. Not about Isabella, not about the pain, but about his life. He told her stories of his own boyhood, of growing up wild in the mountains, of the horse that saved his life in a blizzard, of the time he got into a brawl in a saloon over a matter of honor. He spoke of a life lived on his own terms, a life of solitude, but not of loneliness. And Eliza, in turn, began to share her own fragmented memories. A dry room with a cracked ceiling, a man who smelled of whiskey and stale cigars, the constant, gnawing fear, the silence that came after her mother left. Silas listened, his gaze fixed on the fire, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm of her past. A particularly violent crack of lightning lit up the room, and Eliza flinched, a gasp escaping her lips. Without a word, Silas reached down and placed his large, warm hand over hers. His touch was firm, grounding. "You're not alone now," he said, his voice a solemn vow. "Whatever storm comes, we face it together." At that moment, a loud crash from outside made them both jump. A shutter had been torn loose from the main cabin and was banging against the wall. "Stay here," Silas commanded, grabbing his coat. But a new, wild courage surged through Eliza. The courage of Isabella. The strength of Silas. "Let me help," she said, her voice firm. "We face it together." He looked at her, a flash of pride and something akin to awe in his eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. Together, they braved the deluge. The wind tore at them, the rain soaked them to the bone, but they worked as a team, fighting the storm to lash the shutter back into place. When it was done, they stood for a moment in the pouring rain, drenched and shivering, and then, inexplicably, they both started to laugh. It was a wild, cathartic sound, a shared shout of defiance against the storm, against the past, against all the forces that had tried to break them. Back inside, dripping and laughing, Silas looked at her, his eyes shining in the firelight. "You have your mother's fire, Eliza, and you're braver than any man I know." "You taught me," she shrugged, shivering but with a heart full of warmth. That night, Eliza slept not in her own bed, but on the sofa by the hearth, wrapped in warm quilts, the scent of wood smoke and rain clinging to her. She no longer feared the storms. Now, every crack of thunder was a reminder not of being abandoned, but of the night she chose to stand beside the man who had chosen her first. It was the night she truly became the devil's own daughter, not as a curse, but as a badge of honor, wild, untamable, and fiercely loved. Part 6. The Law of the Heart. Years passed. The filly born the year Eliza arrived grew into a fine mare that only she could ride. The small room Silas had built for her now had curtains she had sewn herself and a small shelf filled with books he'd bought for her in town. She had grown from a scrawny, silent child into a young woman of quiet strength and startling beauty, with her mother's violet eyes and her father's unyielding spirit. The name Sadie Kane was a distant echo, replaced by the reality of Eliza Kane, the rancher's daughter. The knock on the door came on a bright, cloudless Tuesday in late summer. It wasn't a tentative rap, but a firm, authoritative sound that made Silas, who was cleaning a rifle at the table, stiffen instantly. He opened the door to find a man in a dusty black suit, with a graying beard and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much of the world's troubles. He held a black satchel in one hand and a folded paper in the other. "Jedediah Kane?" the man asked, his voice dry as dust. Silas flinched at the use of his old name, the one he'd shared with Isabella. He had been Silas Kane for so long, the name on the land deed, the name he gave himself after she left. "I go by Silas Kane," he corrected, his voice flat and guarded. Eliza moved to stand beside him, her presence a silent statement of solidarity. "I am Judge Sterling, out of Carson County," the man announced, his eyes flicking from Silas to Eliza, taking in her plain but well-made dress, the neat braids in her hair, and the unwavering confidence in her stance. "I'm here because of a letter, one written by a Miss Eleanor Bright some years ago. It concerned a girl, abandoned on the church steps with no known kin." Silas's hand tightened on the doorframe. "She's here." The judge's gaze lingered on Eliza. "You've kept her then, all this time?" "Not kept," Silas bit out, his voice sharp as flint. "Raised. She's my daughter, in every way that matters." Judge Sterling unfolded the paper. "Miss Bright passed on last winter. Among her effects, this note was found, urging the court to verify the girl's safety. There were concerns, rumors in Providence Gulch, a reclusive man, a mysterious child. Some feared she might have been taken in for labor, or worse." A fire ignited in Eliza's violet eyes. She stepped forward, her voice clear and ringing with a conviction that made the judge take a step back. "Sir," she began, "that man gave me more than a name or a roof. He gave me back my soul. When I was a ghost, he taught me how to be solid. When I was silent, he taught me my own voice by showing me the value of his. He sat up all night with a cool cloth on my head when I had a fever. He taught me how to read, how to ride, how to build a fence, and how to tell which storms are worth running from and which are worth facing. He never once asked me to earn my keep. He just stayed. She took a breath, her gaze shifting to Silas, her love for him a palpable force in the room. He is my father, and this is my home. No piece of paper can make that more true, and no piece of paper can take it away. The judge listened, his expression shifting from professional scrutiny to something like wonder. He looked from the fiery young woman to the silent, formidable man beside her. He had come expecting to find a victim. He had found a family. He nodded slowly, a deep solemnity in his eyes. I have seen enough. He reached into his satchel and pulled out another document, this one bearing a golden seal. This is for you, Mr. Kane. Official guardianship papers. According to the law of this territory, she is yours. Silas's eyes, which rarely showed emotion, shone with a fierce, protective light. He took the paper, his hand, for the first time since Eliza had known him, unsteady. Eliza let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding and wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in his chest. Thank you, Silas said quietly to the judge. The judge tipped his hat, a genuine smile finally breaking through his weary demeanor. I reckon the thanks belongs to you both. Some folks are bound by blood and still get it wrong. You two, you were bound by something stronger. You did this right. As the judge rode away, the porch felt warmer than the summer sun could make it. The world had come knocking, not to take her away, but to finally recognize what she and Silas had known all along. She was home. She was a Kane, and no storm could ever touch them again. The note, the one scrawled in charcoal on a piece of canvas, still rests in the cedar chest, alongside Isabella's letters. Eliza could have burned it, could have let the wind take the ashes of that painful memory. But she keeps it. It is her genesis. It's the first proof that a desperate, passionate love put her on the path to this life, and the last remnant of the world that cast her out. That note once felt like a curse, a brand of abandonment. Now, it is a promise she sees fulfilled every time Silas calls her daughter. Every time she rides her mare across the land that is her birthright. It is a story of a girl left behind, and the fierce, wild love of a family that refused to leave her there. A testament that the most profound families aren't always born of blood, but are forged in the fires of shared storms and the sacred quiet of unconditional love. Thank you for joining us for another tale from the heart of the frontier. If this story moved you, please show your support. Like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a real story, and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of resilience, love, and the untamed human spirit.